Okay, let's start with what's really important. Patriots or Seahawks?
Patriots. Seahawks.
Now that we know there's different opinions, now that we know we could start, right? That's all that we needed to know.
We're having a Patriots annual.
It's a good screen, right? Years ago we used to do that, but we stopped that. Okay. Let's go live here. Okay, let's begin. Today, aside from being Super Bowl Sunday, it is also the International Convention for Chabad Shluchos, for Chabad women directing Chabad communities. Connie is currently there in New York. It's in New York, in Crown Heights. You are able to watch the convention live if you'd like. I think it's at 1 o'clock. Let me see.
It's on 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock? I thought it was 1 o'clock. Let me see.
Here you go.
You go to chabad.org/kinus, KINUS. Oh, it's at 5 o'clock. You're right. So you'll have to decide between that and the Super Bowl. Or you could go.
About
6:30. Okay. Let's begin. I want to reiterate again, just a housekeeping note. There's a lot of interesting discussions to be made within these classes. A lot of questions that come up, and I'd love to discuss them. But I do ask to only bring up questions or comments when we give time for it. It's not that I don't want to have the conversation. It's just that it's difficult for others that are trying to follow along what's being said, and it breaks that thought process, the flow of the conversation. So, as I said, we do give time for discussion, for questions, but we ask to keep it to those times. Today we're going to journey into the cobblestone streets of Krakow, the snow-laden city of Borisov, Russia, the bustling squares of Italy, and the vibrant port city of Salonika. In lesson number 1, page 154, lesson number 4. So lesson number 1, we explored fascinating questions posed to rabbis across centuries. We learned how questions are so important. Questions in Judaism, just the question itself says so much about the situation, the community, the times, etc. The second lesson, we began uncovering the process of halakhic decision-making, where before doing anything, we got to know the facts on the ground. We got to know what's actually taking place. What is the issue that the rabbi is facing? Last week, we examined more traditional academic side of the rabbi's work, how he studies, analyzes, and applies the situation. Now, there are some, after last week's class, some people felt that there weren't enough considerations taken into place as far as the emotional circumstances, the situation of the person. Shouldn't we be more caring of the situation? Shouldn't we be more concerned about what the family, what the couple, what the person is going through? It sounds like it's almost like a dry decision being made, and the truth is all that is not the case. And we're going to see today how you have to take in, the job of the rabbis to take in many considerations when making those decisions. Now, to be clear, those considerations have to be within the line of halacha, of Jewish law. But there are many considerations to be made. So we're going to take a look at two primary cases, but these two cases will cover a lot more. So number one is the Krakow couple. And the second one we're going to call liturgical disturbances. Liturgical disturbances, thank you. And each of these are going to bring up earlier controversies in which we will be able to learn about the situation at hand. So the first story takes place in 1570 in Krakow. The rabbi's name is Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Ramah. Now you may know this name of Ramah. He is the author of what we call today the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. He is the central halachic figure in Jewish law. He put together the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, and together with Rabbi Yosef Cairo, they co-authored the Code of Jewish Law from both a Sephardic and Ashkenazi perspective, thereby covering all bases of all Jewish backgrounds. We're going to talk a little bit about Sephardi and Ashkenazi later on. So we're going to read the story and then we're going to break this down. Now, before we read the story, understand this captures a realistic scene of Jewish life in the 16th century, but understand that things then were not the same that they are today. Life then was different. The social norms was different. The expectations were different. And so it's important to understand that. Let's take a look and read text number 1. A man here who had fallen into financial ruin arranged a proper match for his grown daughter. During their long engagement, the father passed away. Without her father or mother, the daughter remained alone. Her relatives acted as strangers and did not support her, except for the mother's brother, who took her into his home. No closer relative helped her as the wedding day approached and preparations for the wedding meal and ceremony needed to be made. The dowry was promised to the groom, was nowhere in sight, and other wedding-related expenses were left unaddressed. A neighbor reassured her that the dowry would be provided and advised her to prepare for the wedding and to go to the mikveh, which is done always before the wedding. She followed this advice, and on Friday, the wedding day, they veiled her, as is customary. So the custom then was, today, generally the custom is that the groom veils the bride. In those days, the custom was that the family veiled the bride, and then they went on with the wedding. As the afternoon, and once she was veiled, that was officially the start of the wedding. And then she's not unveiled until after the chuppah, etc. As the afternoon progressed and Shabbos approached, the relatives clenched their fists and didn't contribute adequately towards the dowry. Approximately a third of the total was missing. At this point, the groom retreated, refusing to proceed with the ceremony. He paid no heed to the community leaders, pleased not to shame the Jewish girl due to financial concerns. The murmurings about him didn't bother him, nor did the rabbi's reprimand have any effect. In this way, disagreement and dispute continued until finally 90 minutes into the night, when it was already Shabbos, they reached an agreement and the groom was willing to go to the chuppah. So let's break this down. So you have this orphan girl. She lost her mother. Her father engaged her, found her a nice groom. Then tragically, he passed away. And now she has no money. And only a relative was willing to care for her and give her a dowry. Now, I know that sounds a little bit not inconsiderate, should I say, but the reality is that back in the day, who you married also meant what your future financial situation would be. And this was a form of, you know, being sure that you're going to have that financial stability. In some communities, it's like that still today, but not to the extent of this. So the good news is that although for her, she was a widow, I'm sorry, she was an orphan and didn't have anything, but now she's going to be married. She's going to have this financial stability that was desperately needed. And the problem is that her father also had to pledge a dowry towards the wedding. And this was considered sort of binary, so acceptable by both sides. And this affected the entire marriage arrangement, as you can see. And now the groom is not willing to go because something didn't pull through. It was a big deal. It was a big deal because this was the economic focus on marriage, is something that was part of what they did. And they were all ready to go. And now she's not able to pull through. So her family members said to her, even if the groom is not willing to come, just go ahead with it. And it's going to pull through. It's going to happen. They assumed that some relatives could scrape together some funds to make it happen. They placed the veil on her. And as I said, once you place the veil on, then the wedding starts. And if you take that veil off, that's considered a very uneasy and disturbing message if a girl is going to the chuppah, does not actually pull through and ends up pulling the veil and does not go through with the wedding. That's very embarrassing, and it's a very sad situation. The Jewish community found the groom's actions appalling. How come he's not going to the wedding? There was murmurs by even attempts by the rabbi to try and convince him, but he was not going to hear from it. Now, in his mind, for his side of the story, he says, "Why should I forsake money I rightfully deserve and my ability to start a normal life?" He says it would be irresponsible of me to be willing to go forward with this. You could see, I mean, I'm not saying that he's right, but if somebody says that we're going to help you with an apartment and a home and things to start off your wedding, to start off your life, and then they back off, and you say, well, that's a red line. I can't start all of my life without having some sort of stability. Now you may wonder why she didn't back out. Look, she was an orphan. She didn't have necessarily so many options. Anyway, regardless, she still wanted to go through with the wedding. The family still wanted to go through with it. And now, how do we get the groom on board? Finally, a deal was struck. There was one problem. So a family member came through, an uncle, whoever it was, promised, a brother, whatever, promised, we're going to take care of it. The problem is, and now it's already Shabbos. The custom then was that weddings were always scheduled for Friday afternoon. Not like today when there's many days in the week where we do weddings. Back then, or at least in those communities, weddings were always done on Friday. It's not clear why it was always that way. Some say because in communities living in poverty, so this way you could sort of knock out two birds with one stone. You have your Shabbat dinner, the community Shabbat dinner, and the wedding dinner coming together. Others say that it was maybe because people were traveling a lot back in the day for business, and this way, everyone's going to be in town, everyone's going to be available. It wasn't like today where you could hop on a flight and go to a wedding for one day and be back the next day. So, it was more practical for a wedding on Friday. Either way, Friday was the day that weddings were done. And so now you have the wedding set, the wedding time set, and now they're going, this whole feud is going on back and forth, and they don't settle it until it's already 90 minutes into Shabbos. Okay, so what's the problem? So take a look at text number 2. Maimonides Mishnah Torah, the halacha tells us, the Jewish law tells us that what cases are not judged on Shabbos and Kiddushin, betrothal, is not performed. These rabbinic decrees ensure we don't come to right. They say that the rabbi was walking to shul on Shabbos, and he walks by a house and he sees there's 3 guys there playing poker, trading their money on Shabbos. He stormed into the house and he says, I demand an explanation. What's going on? Don't you know you're not allowed to do this? You're not allowed to play poker on Shabbos. The first one says, oh, Rabbi, I forgot it's Shabbos today. The second one says, I forgot you're not allowed to play poker on Shabbos. The third one says, Rabbi, I forgot to put down the shades.
Still under rabbinic supervision.
Rabbinic supervision, that's another one. Anyway, so Shabbos, you're not allowed to do Kiddushin. Now, notice what it says, the reason why. It is what's called a Gzeira. Gzeira means it's a rabbinical decree because it would bring to writing. What type of writing is involved in a wedding? You have to write a ketubah. You may have to write other things. You may have to do other things. Today it's even more expensive. There's pictures and music and all kinds of things. Today it's for sure out of the question, but even then, you were not allowed to make weddings on Shabbos. So, but to be clear, this is a rabbinic decree. So now it's Shabbos. It's 90 minutes after nightfall. Shabbos has already begun. The groom is in his tuxedo, ready to go. The bride is in her veil, ready to go. And the question is, will it be delayed? What will happen? Now, to be clear, it's easy to say, come on, it's a poor girl. This is her only option. Just let her do the wedding. What's the big deal? It's unfair to everyone involved. There's so much money involved. There's so much preparations involved. All right, so you'll forego Shabbos for one time. But that's not how halacha works. Halacha means that you have to work within the confines of Jewish law. Now, if you could find within the confines of Jewish law how to deal with this situation, then okay. And that is the job of a rabbi. Look within Jewish law and say, could we find some way that we could allow this situation to happen? And so the Rama, who, as I said, was the greatest codifier of Jewish law, one of the greatest that we ever had, he literally wrote the book, The Code of Jewish Law. He said he went ahead and did the wedding. And not only that, but he told his congregation, you are not to pray the Friday night evening service until I finish this wedding, and then I'll come to synagogue and I will do the Friday night services. Don't think that there wasn't an uproar. Don't think that the other rabbis then didn't start yelling at him and saying, what are you doing? This is not allowed according to Jewish law. Did you hear what Rabbi Moshe did? He did something that everybody agrees you're not allowed to do. And we can understand this uproar because it's very clear halacha, it's very clear law, that the sages prohibited these acts on Shabbos because of accidental writing. So the Rabbah responded by composing a tshuva explaining and defending his actions. Now we'll soon see what the defense of his actions were. But when you say these are extenuating circumstances and I feel bad for this young woman, so I'll make an exception, that doesn't work. You have to show me within the lines of Jewish law how we can make the exception. So we're soon gonna get into how the thought process of how this came about. Any questions so far? Okay, so now we're gonna break down his thought process. So, like all central laws, the Rama accepts that this is the law, that this is the way we follow, because it actually goes back to a Mishnah. We read earlier the Maimonides, which is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman for Rambam. By the way, we just started again the cycle of learning the book of Maimonides, which that's taken from, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe encouraged to study parts of the book of Maimonides every day. There's 14 books, and if you study one chapter a day, you'll finish it in 3 years. If you finish 3 chapters a day, you'll finish it every year, which is the cycle that I follow. But just recently, we concluded the cycle of the 1 chapter a day. So those who want to get on board, you can find about a dozen different classes online. Just go to Chabad.org, Rambam, and you'll see a dozen different classes, and you'll literally study the entire Torah, all 613 commandments in detail. The Rambam is the only one that does it to that extent. So if you want to know the entire Torah, study the Rambam. It's all it is 1 chapter a day. Most times you can finish it within 10-15 minutes. Anyway, and like I said, the cycle is just starting now, and so it's a good time to hop on board. So now I'm done with my commercial. Put that in the
Question of that, please. So. Was able to go ahead with the, which, okay, want the marriage secretary thing. Because he's an author, but you need him.
Right, but yeah, look, you know, maybe it actually shows something about the guy. Maybe it shows that he's someone that's not willing to, you know, to bend to social pressure. Maybe that's something that you liked about.
Yeah, but it also seems very quickly here, it was a wrong one.
Okay.
I've been in the bill. Maybe she felt that she wanted children, and therefore, if she did not marry at this point in time, she would lose the opportunity to
Could be.
have children.
Could be.
Right.
You know, it's not clear, but again, you know, we're going back to a time where this, you know, marriage was not just finding love. Marriage was finding your future. Okay, and part of finding the future was finding a person that could give you that financial stability. That was not only from the women's side, that was from the man's side as well. Yeah. Suddenly there ended up being a lot of questions.
What's the be that they got the money before they got and then they got the money too? Yeah, the financial.
I don't know. Like I don't know the details. Maybe they had to use it on funeral expenses. It's unclear. Well, maybe he didn't have money, right? But I mean, he arranged it. He promised the dowry. Maybe he promised the dowry and didn't have the money. It could be. I don't know. This is the story. You know, Yiddish would say afakasha effectively nishkin shilas, and sorry, afamaisa effectively nishkin shilas, and on a story you don't ask questions. This was the story. Yeah. Yeah.
Or visit the ceremony, the marriage ceremony. I'm trying to.
The writing of Tuba is part of it. There's other aspects of writing. You write the Tanayim, which is also like the conditions, the agreements between them. There is writing that's involved. A number of different aspects. So clearly, in this case where he allowed it, they clearly had to take care of all the writing before Shabbos. But so it could be done in a way where the writing is done before Shabbos, and then the rest of the ceremony is done on Shabbos. But the Mishnah is telling us that we don't do it because it may bring you to write on Shabbos, which is clearly a violation of Shabbos. In this, so it could be done before, but the problem is that we're afraid that if it becomes normal to have weddings on Shabbos, eventually you'll end up writing on Shabbos. Because we forgot the ketubah and we have to write. There will always be situations where it will be a problem. So therefore the law is very clear that you're not allowed to, because it could bring to write on Shabbos. But to be clear, the marriage itself is not one of the violations of Shabbos. It's that our sages forbade it because it will bring you to violate Shabbos by having to write on Shabbos or other things involved. Okay, so let's continue on now. So now we're going to go through the analysis. Says the Mishnah, these are quasi mitzvot that the sages forbade on Shabbos. We don't educate and we don't betroth. Now we're using a term here, which is a very rough term, which is, let's see, here online, just checking it online. Second, let me do something here. Sorry. Okay. We're using a term which is we're translating it as quasi mitzvot. The word in Hebrew is reshut, which means things that you're allowed to do. So we're translating it as quasi mitzvot. There's certain things that are quasi mitzvot that are forbade on Shabbos. We don't educate and we don't betroth. So now the Talmud asks a question on this Mishnah. And the question is, we don't betroth, but isn't it a full-fledged mitzvah? Again, the Hebrew word is reshut, which means a mitzvah that's allowed. In other words, not a necessitative mitzvah, but a mitzvah that you're allowed to do if you want. Okay, so that's what we're calling a quasi mitzvah, a mitzvah that you could do if you would like to do it, but not a necessary mitzvah. So the mitzvah, so the Talmud says, what do you mean? Marriage is not a quasi mitzvah; it's a full-fledged mitzvah. Marriage is a full-fledged mitzvah. And the Gemara answers, the Talmud answers, that we're discussing a case where he has already married and have children. So now let's break this down a little bit. Take a look at exercise 4.1. The Talmud is asking a question. So the Mishnah says that we don't do marriages on Shabbos. Why? Because it's a mitzvah that is a quasi mitzvah, one that you could or could not do depending on your choice. So therefore, we don't allow it. Now, there's two ways. Now, the Talmud says, what do you mean? It's a full-fledged mitzvah. So there's two ways that you could ask the question. Either you could say the Talmud is asking, why are we calling it a quasi-mitzvah? It's actually a full-fledged mitzvah. In other words, that it's simply asking about the classification, saying it's asking about the terminology of the Mishnah. In other words, it's not arguing, the Talmud is not arguing on the substantive law, but it's simply saying, what do you mean? Why are you calling it that? It's a mitzvah. In other words, one way to read the Talmud, I agree that we're not allowed to do marriage on Shabbos, but why are you calling it a reshus? Why are you calling it a quasi mitzvah? It's a full-fledged mitzvah. Marriage is the very first mitzvah in the Torah. God tells Adam to get married, right? Pru, you have to populate the earth. That's the very first mitzvah given to all mankind. So why are you calling it a quasi mitzvah? So the first way to read is that it's simply the Talmud is asking about a classification, and the Talmud is answering, no, we're classifying it as thus in a situation where it's a second marriage, someone already has children, in which case they don't have to get married, they could if they want, and so therefore we don't consider it a full-fledged mitzvah, but it's only a partial mitzvah. In other words, it's not a mandatory mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah. If you want, you could get married a second time. If you already have children, you fulfilled the mitzvah, so to speak, of marriage. That's if you would see it as a classification question. But another way to read this is no. The Talmud is asking on the whole situation. What do you mean you can't get married on Shabbos? Because it's only a quasi mitzvah. It's a full-fledged mitzvah. You should be allowed to do it on Shabbos. How could we exempt you from this mitzvah just because of some questionable situation that may come up? You end up writing on Shabbos. It's a full-fledged mitzvah. And so, based on that, the risk of writing doesn't seem to be a reason enough to ban it on Shabbos. If the Talmud is only asking about the wording, why are you wording it this way, but it agrees with the actual law, so then the answer is we only use that wording because we're talking about a second marriage. But if it's a substantive question, then that would be a very different answer when you're saying, oh, it's talking about a second marriage, which means that what? That what if it's a first marriage? Then you should be allowed to have that first marriage on Shabbos based on reading the Talmud that way. So again, let's just go through this briefly. Depending on how you read the question, see this is why you have to know how to read a Talmud, and don't just say the rabbi's job. This is actually disputed amongst the commentaries in the Talmud of how you read the question, right? You have to be careful. Where are you putting the commas? Where you put the commas could read in a completely different sentence, right? So again, is the question of the Talmud asking, what do you mean they're doing a full-fledged mitzvah? Okay, now in other words, we don't like the terminology of calling it a reshus, a quasi mitzvah, because it's a full-fledged mitzvah. So we say no, it's using that terminology because it's referring to a second marriage. But the other way of reading it is, what do you mean you're not allowed to get married on Shabbos? Because it's a quasi mitzvah, it's a full-fledged mitzvah. So the Talmud answers, yeah, but if it's a second marriage, it's second marriage, which means that what if it's a first marriage, then it would be allowed. In other words, if that's complicating, then let's just get to the bottom line, which is depending on how you read the Mishnah. Okay, if you understand the explanation given, take a look at page 4.1. I'm sorry, not page 4. I'm sorry, figure point 1, page 160. Option 1, how to read this Mishnah. A discussion about classification. Question: why does the Mishnah refer to the wedding as a quasi mitzvah? The answer is the man was already married and had to fulfill his mitzvah to bear children. So the result, all weddings are prohibited on Shabbos, but still the Mishnah calls it a quasi mitzvah because specifically in the Mishnah is referring to a case that the man had already had children. The second way to read is how could the sages ban the special mitzvah of the wedding on Shabbos simply due to concern that someone might write? And the answer is because we're talking about a second marriage, which would mean that a man's first wedding is permitted on Shabbos. Now, again, if it's still too difficult, just read the result line. If the whole back and forth is too complicating, just read the result line. Which the point over here is, depending on how you read the question of the Talmud, you would have a different outcome of result and understanding what the mitzvah is. Because if the answer of the Talmud is saying that we're talking about a second marriage, depending on how you read it, one way of reading it, you'll come to the conclusion that all weddings are prohibited on Shabbos, and the Mishnah is simply talking about a case of a second marriage, but a first marriage would still be prohibited. And the second way of reading it is that a man's first wedding is permitted on Shabbos. Again, if it's too complicating, just come to the conclusion, just to know that there are two ways of reading this and two different conclusions. So, to be clear, we have the usual law, which is the majority that a wedding is not permitted on Shabbos, and most hold to that. As we just read in the book of Rambam Maimonides, who quotes the Mishnah, and he says just flat out, weddings are not permitted on Shabbos, period. However, Rashi, who's the codifier, who's the one to first explain the Talmud, he had a remarkable grandson in a book. He had a remarkable grandson in a book known as Tosfos. Tosfos is, as those who came to the Talmud course, you know that there were two sides. One was Rashi and one was his grandchildren. And Tosfos reads this, that actually a first wedding would be permitted on Shabbos, and he is of the opinion that a first wedding, if it's a first marriage, not a second marriage, but a first marriage, would be permitted on Shabbos because that is a strong enough mitzvah to allow that.
But Rabbi,
Hold on one second. We're going to get to questions in a minute. Let's first read text number 4. The Ramah comes to the conclusion as follows, and he says, I'm proud to have said in my name that in a case like this, the wedding is permitted on Shabbos. It's a time of great need. Having already immersed herself in the mikvah for her wedding, the bride would have been humiliated if she had to wait for her chuppah until after Shabbos. Additionally, it's unheard of to keep the veil on through Shabbos and to hold a wedding on Sunday when non-Jews customarily marry in observance of their holy day. So then weddings were never on Sunday. In such a pressing circumstances, Rabbeinu Tam, who is Rashi's grandson, who we mentioned earlier, Rabbeinu Tam, is worthy of being relied upon, especially considering that his interpretation of the Talmudic passage is superior. There cannot be circumstances more extenuating than this, a mature orphan bride facing the humiliation of being treated differently. She would have felt ashamed for many years. Additionally, the quarrels and disputes between the parties could have unraveled the match. At one point, the arguments escalated to the degree that they wanted to remove the veil from the bride, and great is the value of peace between husband and wife. In other words, removing the veil from the bride, that's like you just broke off the marriage right there. Certainly, one should be stringent and careful to ensure that such situations do not arise. However, if all efforts were made, but this time dragged on to nightfall, then there is concern for the disillusion of the match, of the bride's humiliation. One who relies on leniency has not erred. This is the declaration of Moshe, the son of esteemed and pious Rabbi Yisrael, blessed memory, known as Rav Moshe Isserles of Krakow. So basically, let me clarify what he's saying, and then we could hash this out. So what he's saying is like this, saying that there is the halacha, there's acceptable law, which is overall accepted across the board, which is that we do not do weddings on Shabbos. Now, there is a minority opinion, who is Rabbeinu Tam, mentioned, Rashi's grandson, is a minority opinion, who says that you are allowed to do weddings on Shabbos based on his reading of the Mishnah. In other words, most read the Mishnah that it's clear that all weddings are not acceptable, and that's the acceptable law across the board. There is a minority opinion that does read the Mishnah said differently and says that you're actually allowed to do a wedding on Shabbos, given that it would be a first marriage, not a second marriage. The Ramah is saying that in general, we're never going to do marriages on Shabbos. In general, we don't. In extenuating circumstances, like in this case, where there are a few issues that he mentions. Number one, and this is what we would call counterweights in Jewish law. Number one, he said we have to counterweight an issue what's called kavod habrias, which means human dignity. There are times where there are rabbinical laws that are overridden by human dignity. For example, doing a funeral on the second day of Yontif due to the human dignity of the individual. So kavod habrius, sometimes the human dignity could override a rabbinic law. The second issue here is shalom bayis, which is peace in the home. Peace in the home, shalom means peace, bayis of the home, would override certain situations as well. And when this issue comes up, and in this particular situation, we have both the issue of human dignity of this poor girl who's going to be humiliated. And, who knows what's going to be with her and who knows if she'll ever get married. And second of all, the peace in the home that could be brought about this, putting those together, using those counterweights, we now come to the halachic dispensation that, yes, it would be allowed. So this is what the idea of using halachic weights, counterweights, when making a decision. But to be clear, we're using laws, we're using things which are brought down in halacha, in Jewish law, as counterweights. And also, it won't override certain other things. For example, if there is a biblical law, you can't just say, oh, there's human dignity involved, so we're going to do whatever we want. You can't say we're going to go right on Shabbos because there's human dignity. Meaning, if they had to write on Shabbos, that would have been problematic. Clearly, he didn't have to in this case. In other words, so if there is a biblical law, you can't just say human. But if there is a rabbinic law, and it's only because of a questionable issue that may come up, then there are certain counterweights, counterbalance that you could use in certain cases to help out in a situation. And this was the gist of the Ramah's argument. So this explains the scenario that we may have heard about. This is a term called a heter. A heter means that you're allowed to do something in a specific situation, a dispensation of certain behavior in a particular situation. How is a heter possible? How could a rabbi say something is allowed? And by the way, a really good rabbi is one who finds a heter, not a rabbi that says something is not allowed. In other words, if you're calling a rabbi, a good rabbi will find counterweights to help out your situation. Sometimes it's not possible, but a good rabbi finds a heter. So how does this happen? So the rabbi has to use these counterweights to help come to this conclusion. But it's not that I'm bending the law because I feel bad for someone. I am finding within the guidelines of Torah, I'm finding some things to help out in the situation, being that it's only rabbinic law. And there is other opinions who hold that it's completely allowed on Shabbos. It's a minority opinion. We don't always follow that. So now I'm going to use other aspects of counterweights to say, in this particular situation, we're going to override the general view, and we're going to deal with it now. It's worth noting that in his particular situation, he had very little reason to fear any negative consequences from this one-time ruling. But it could be that if there's a situation where even if the rabbi was to feel that it's okay, but maybe some people will see this and start doing things inappropriately, you have to take that into consideration as well. How will other people see it? And as I said, today a wedding is very different. Today a wedding includes many other things that cannot be done on Shabbos, with the with the music and the catering and the pictures and so many other things that are involved with the wedding that cannot be done on Shabbos. So most likely today he would not have given that sort of heter. But it's not that we're looking for loopholes to bypass Shabbos. We're working within the confines of law to come to this conclusion. And as you see in figure 4.2, the Ramah actually wrote about this in Shulchan Aruch in the Code of Jewish Law. This is a picture of the Code of Jewish Law that he wrote, the Shulchan Aruch. The middle box is his writing. And he writes that it says you're not allowed to do a wedding on Shabbos. This is the laws of Shabbos. Not allowed to do a wedding on Shabbos. But if there's extenuating circumstances, for example, kavod habrius, honoring the human dignity. Like, for example, he says, when there's a wedding on Friday, and it may have been he gives an example that the kala and chassan are ready, the bride and groom are already prepared, and everything's ready to go, then it would be permitted, but you should be careful not to come to that situation. Okay, we're going to take questions. Yes.
Rabbi, if the wedding is able to be performed on Shabbos, what do they do about running to do it?
As I said, that's obviously has to be done before Shabbos.
So it would have to be done before.
Yes, 100%.
And so.
She was already covered. She was already veiled. The custom then, as we said, was
Well,
she was pre-veiled. So it wasn't today. Today the groom goes and covers the kala. Then the family did that. Some Sephardic communities still have that custom today. That
yeah.
there's many different customs in weddings. Yes.
7 groups. Do they have groups? Do they do the?
Most likely they would not have done that by the chuppah. Or questions if they would have stamped on the glass. Most likely they probably would not. It's not clear, but I would assume not. In other words, we wouldn't do anything that would be unnecessary, to questionable on Shabbos, I would assume. But that's a good question, but I would say probably not. That's because that's only a custom. That's not actually part of the chuppah. That's a custom to remember the destruction of the Holy Temple, so probably they would not have done it, yes. But most likely before Shabbat, you have to have it done. You could sign the ketubah, and then he just has to hand it to her, right? But it doesn't. You don't have to actually sign it on Shabbos. You could sign it before,
Yes.
and then
They
they did it before, most likely,
had written it before, then he remained.
or maybe they did it after Shabbos. It's not clear when they did it, but clearly they for sure didn't do it on Shabbos.
But
I would say they probably did it before, but
you learn to do it. Because it's after the event.
the ketubah could be done after the chuppah. Yes,
Okay.
yes. One second. Question here.
Since the primary organization would be the children, he marries, and when we gave his was the second marriage, or the first marriage, he so children, whether the decision might be.
Well, if it was a second marriage, then clearly would not have been allowed. Oh, you're saying if there were no children? Yeah, it's a good question. I guess that it's pretty clear that the mitzvah of marriage is associated with having children, and so no, it's the mitzvah of marriage. So yeah, I guess if he didn't have any children, then it would probably be the same thing, even if it's a second marriage. Yeah. Again, it's not clear.
They're gonna sign it.
No, the ketubah is always signed before the chuppah. Okay, now what they do today is today by weddings, the way most common Jewish weddings are, they have what they call the badekin or the so they have a pre-party, so to speak, and during that time the rabbi does all the technicalities. Okay, he signs all the documents, he prepares everything, and then they go on. Then after that, they go on to the chuppah. By the chuppah, they read the already signed ketubah, and the groom will hand that to the bride. But the signing of it, which has to be signed by 2 witnesses, that's done before the actual chuppah. So it's very possible it was done before. If you did not do it before, you could still write a ketubah afterwards. It doesn't violate the marriage in any way. It doesn't. It's not the marriage is still a marriage, even if you do the ketubah afterwards. So it could be it was done after. The assumption is that it was done before.
In this case, in question, we know why the bride stayed and said it.
Because there was a family member who agreed to pay for the bride was ready, it was the groom who was not.
You know why? Because he said, no, I'm not going to pay for it. I'm not paying this.
Because there was a family member who came forward to help with the expenses. Yes.
We don't get. Well.
The ketubah is a rabbinical law. It's not.
Alright, so we could hear this, like even someone bringing and saying, however, we
Correct.
so what's the big R?
There's two parts of marriage. One is called the kiddushin and one's called the nisuin. Back in the day, they were done as two completely separate ceremonies. You would put on the ring, as you said, say harat mekudeshesli, which is called the kiddushin. That's a betrothal. It's not a full marriage. They would do a year later. They would then go the nisuin, which is part of the ketubah, and they would finalize the wedding, so to speak. Today it's done as one ceremony. So when you're going under the chuppah, you're also bringing her into your home, so to speak. That's part of the idea of the chuppah. And then afterwards, you also go into a private room together, and that, so to speak, seals the deal. When that's what's called the nisuin. But if you just do the first part, which is called the kiddushin, you still, for all practical purposes, are considered married. For halachically, you're still considered married, and you would need a get from that if you just do that first part of marriage, which is one of the reasons they do it today, everything together, because it came with a lot of complications separating them. Okay, we're good? Any other questions? You good? No? Okay. So just for discussion's sake, we're going to take a look at some other counterbalances used. Take a look at page 180. These are some other counterweights. I'm not going to read the questions. I'll let you go through them on your own, but I'll just go through some of the terminology here. You have the first one called Lifnim Mishur Asadin, which means that you're going beyond the letter of the law. So sometimes if you're going beyond the letter of the law, do you have to go? I'm not going to go with the question. I'm just going to go through the terminology. You can read the questions on your own. Maris Ayin means concern about what it may look like to others, or if it could be taken in the wrong way. Sha'as Hashmad means that if it's a time of some sort of decree against the Jewish people, then sometimes we would allow things that we wouldn't in other circumstances. Pikuach nefesh, to save a life, and you could pretty much do anything to save a life, anything that's life-threatening. Chola she'ein bal sakana means if there's a sick person, but he's not in a dangerous mode. So if there's some sort of illness, but it's not a life-threatening illness. So, for example, eating on Yom Kippur, it would be a difference if it's a life-threatening situation, or if it's someone that's sick that's not in a life-threatening situation. The response, whether or not you could eat on Yom Kippur, would be different. So our gadol is if there's much pain in that particular situation. Not to embarrass someone that could not afford or doesn't have that thing. Sha'as hadchak means a very extenuating circumstance. Hefsid meruva means if there will be a big loss, a big financial loss, in this situation. Tzorech mitzvah means something that is necessary for a mitzvah. Tircha de tzibura means if it's something that will get in the way of the community, bothering the community. One of the reasons we take out two Torahs when we have two different readings is so that the congregation shouldn't have to sit and wait when we have to when we have to roll the Torah to another place. Los Eskodadu means you should not you should not have separate congregations doing separate things. Mechzi Kiyura means you look like you're trying to be more religious than necessary. Means that we don't want to do something that would question about what others have done in the past. So I'll let you read those on your own, but just to show you, this is terminology that a rabbi has to use when trying to trying to weigh out the situation. By the way, this is why the job of a rabbi, and coming to a conclusion is not easy. And and when you hear a rabbi saying that I became a rabbi by doing an online course, you may know how to give a pulpit speech, or you may know how to read Hebrew or lead services, but that's not essentially the job of a rabbi. I mean, that's what I do here, but that's not really the job of a rabbi. A halachic authority rabbi is to know the code of Jewish law and to know how to respond in a particular situation. Sometimes I would have to go to a rabbi when something comes up that I would need help with these counterweights, and sometimes I've had situations where I presented it to a more esteemed rabbi who then said you have to go to to an authority that is knowledgeable in this particular field. And so just to understand that that coming to a halachic conclusion, there's a lot involved in making those decisions. Okay. Now we're going to talk about something a little lighter, the evolution of prayer. The term that when a rabbi comes to a conclusion, just another terminology, it's called a psak. A psak means a halachic ruling, and a authority that gives that halachic ruling is called a posek. A posek. Now, we're going to now move on to page 166. So first, we're going to give a little background here. So to understand this case, the vast liturgy of Shalos Teshuvos is filled with examples of rabbis discussing counterweights, and now we're going to look in the 1700s. But this particular case, we're going to see how within this counterweight, we have to look at two other cases to come to the conclusion of this particular case. So we'll explain what we mean. So to understand this, first we're going to take a little background, the evolution of prayer. Much of the prayer that we have is actually remarkable uniformity across time and place. There's 3 daily prayers, there's 19 blessings, and they go back to what's known as the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. Now within those, we have the basic outline of what the prayers are, but the exact liturgy, the exact wording could be, has changed a little bit over time. And what happened is the core prayer, while being consistent, but some words here and there change based on the communities with minor variations in prayer that developed regionally. So you have Jews in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in Yemen. For example, I'll give you just one very common one. We say in the Kaddish, we say, v'yatzmach B'alma Debaruch Yerusei v'yamlech Malchusei v'yatzmach Porkane v'Kar Meshicha. And those who are of Ashkenazi, they say, they just skip that line. What does that word mean? Some people know what I'm talking about. Some don't even know what I'm talking about. But it's an added line in the Kaddish, which is said by the Sephardim. The simple reason of why Yatzmach Porkane Vikar Mashiach says that God should hasten His redemption and bring us His Mashiach, His Redeemer. Now, those living in very Christian communities, they may have been afraid to say that line because that could have brought up a lot of questions amongst those Christian communities. So things like that, although the overall Kaddish is the same, but you may have one or two lines or a few words that are changed. So you may have Jews in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in Yemen, and they each develop their own what's called nusach. Nusach means the exact liturgy of the word. Another example on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, we have a bunch of additions to the prayers. They're called piyutim. One very famous one that we say is Nisana Tokef, Kedusha Sayom. We say who shall live, who shall die, right? That whole paragraph there. Very moving paragraph. It's one of the most moving paragraphs in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy. Well, I got news for you. In some Sephardic communities, they don't say it at all. It's actually not part of the actual liturgy. So, because it's not part of the original liturgy, it was added later. So some accepted it, some communities accepted it, some didn't. Now, there was the 16th century Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, known as the Arizal, the great lion, the great leader of the Kabbalistic movement, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. And he put together a nusach that's today known as the Arizal's nusach, which, if you'll notice, it says in our prayer book, the nusach of Ari, that's what we use in Chabad today. But, to be clear, there's many different versions within the Arizal's. It's based, his teachings are based on Kabbalah, but there's many different versions of that as well. Our version that we use is based on how the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, took the foundational teachings of the Arizal and then he made a siddur out of that. But there are other versions of the Arizal as well. Now here's the problem. For those who wanted to follow the Kabbalistic way of prayer, you want to follow the Arizal, the Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal's teachings. Just one problem. That if you want to follow that, then that means that you have to use the Sephardic version of prayer. And for those that are of Ashkenazi descent, if you're of Ashkenazi descent and you have an Ashkenazi prayer book, but you still want to follow the Arizal's customs, it doesn't really work. So in about the year 1792, the conflict broke out in the city of Borisov, which was in Belarus. What happened was the Hasidic movement started to become more rampant, started to become more inspirational, and people, the younger generation, started moving towards the Hasidic teachings. They were drawn to it more, and now the older generation, who some of them were of what we call misnagdim, or not of the Hasidic way of life, they were uncomfortable with the way that their children were going. And now, one of the big issues was the prayer book. Because now the younger generation, they started following the nusach of the Arizal, which meant that they were now using the Sephardic prayer, primarily based on the Sephardic prayer book. And those of their parents said, wait, you grew up using the Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi comes mainly from Germany, France, whereas the Sephardi come from Spain, Italy, Yemen, places like that. And so the Ashkenazi parents, which was in White Russia, those were mostly Ashkenazi. And now their children are now praying the Sephardi custom. Now for us, it may not sound like a big deal, but for them it was a big deal. They said, you are changing the way we've been praying for years. So the city's rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer Katz, he regarded the parents' concern as valid and wrote a question to the Alter Rebbe. What should I do with these people? He says, look, it seems that even if he didn't follow the Hasidic teachings himself, but he tried to be as accommodating to all aspects of the Jewish community. And now you have this break-off synagogue that's now praying different than their parents were praying, and their parents are furious. And so he's trying to balance it out as the rabbi of the city. So he turns to the Alter Rebbe, the Chabad Rebbe, who I guess you could say sort of he's to blame for it, maybe. And he says, how can I keep peace? So he says like this, text number 5. To his esteemed and renowned Rabbi Eliezer Katz, I hope my brevity in responding to all the detailed questions and extensive arguments in your letter does not offend you. God knows and bears witness to the time that does not allow me to write with great length. Perhaps it will be God's will that we meet during one of my visits to Poland where we can talk in person. It is clear from your letter that you are a true lover of peace, like your ancestor Aaron, the high priest. His name was Katz. Katz is usually a Kohen. That's why it says, like your ancestor Aaron. As a result, you have intervened in a matter of ... those in your community who opposed the new congregation. You sided with the parents protesting their son's attendance due to the changes in liturgy, which according to your honorable opinion are improper. You assume that the parents too are acting with pure intentions for the sake of heaven. So there were a few arguments that he had. So let's go through his arguments. Number one, first, he said that there is a mitzvah in the Torah that we just read yesterday in the 10 Commandments. You shall honor your father and mother. So they are going against their parents' wishes. Seemingly that's a problem. That's number one. And second of all, he says, what about preserving Jewish customs? If this is your family custom, this is your tradition. We all know tradition, right? You got to keep tradition. If this is your family's custom, then you got to do it. And so now they convinced the children had no right to alter their nusach. So now the Alter Rebbe is going to respond to both of these particular issues. Okay, let's go back. What are the two issues primarily? Number one, are you allowed to contradict your parents? And number two, what about deviating from customs that you have in your family? And these are both very important issues. So let's first deal with the first one, which is, does the Torah allow a person... So he goes back to a previous question, which is, does the Torah allow a person to marry someone their parents disapprove of? This is how we're going to deal with the first question. Because this is a question that has already been dealt with in previous generations, and again, we're looking for cases in previous generations that we could compare it to. So it says, with regards to the question of honoring your parents, your father or mother, we're going to deal with a question that's already been brought up in the Talmud, which is, okay, are you allowed to marry someone that your parents disapprove of? Good question. Now, in modern society, the tendency for adults to relate to their parents is sort of, it's almost like an equal balance. It's almost like a social relationship, a parent and a child, which we're not going to get into all the issues with the modern social issues and the problems with the normity today. And maybe that's why some children are being brought up the way they are. But without getting into all that, the main point is that Torah doesn't see it in that way at all. Okay, Torah doesn't see it that way at all. Torah, it's very clear. If you honoring your father or mother is not based on how you feel towards your parents or how much how many iPads your parents give you, or how many vacations your parents take you on. It's a mitzvah to honor them regardless, even if they are not the nicest parents. And so the Torah tells us of two things. So in Western society, it's equality. In Torah, there's two aspects. Number one, honor and reverence. So Hashem Elokecha, honor your father and mother. And it also says, your father and mother you shall revere. The word fear means respect. So these two questions was brought up to Rabbi Yosef Kolon, known as the Ma'arik, who we brought up in lesson 1. And he goes through these. But first, let's read the Talmud. The Talmud says like this, text number 6. How do we define biblical mandates to revere and honor parents? To revere means not standing in their place, not sitting in their place, not contradicting their words, and not taking sides against them. To honor means helping them with food and drink, clothing and covering, and coming and going. By the way, when the Torah goes through these two issues of honor and reverence, the Torah switches father and mother. One, it says father first and then mother, then it says mother first and then father, to tell you that they're both equal. But according to this passage, now let's go to the questions. So what do you have to do? You have to tend to their needs. The honor means not sitting in their place, not contradicting their words, not taking sides against them, helping them with food, drink, clothing, covering, coming, and going. So honor means tending to their needs, and to put it in a simple one-liner, honoring means tending to their needs, and reverence means respecting their space. That is the job of a child. As far as the mitzvah, if you want to do more than that, of course, it's better. But as far as the mitzvah, fulfilling the mitzvah, that your obligation of honoring and your father or mother is, number one, you have to tend to their needs, and number two, respect their space. Now, based on that, would you be allowed to marry someone that your parents disapprove of?
Yeah. Yes.
So we have some people say yes, some people say no. So let's see. Let's see what the Maharik says. Maharik says like this. Text number 7. It is obvious that a parent does not have the authority to object to a child's marital decisions, neither on the basis of honor nor reverence, because honor applies only to actions related to food, drink, clothing, footwear, and similarly things related to the parent's needs. Reverence means not sitting in their place, not contradicting their words, and the like matters specifically related to the parents. But in matters unrelated to the parents, they obviously have no authority to interfere with their child's actions. They say that Mrs. Goldberg was talking to her friend and saying, my son is something else. He went to Las Vegas in a $25,000 car, and he came back in a $100,000 vehicle. And the parents and her friend says, wow, he made a lot of good money in Vegas. She says, no, he went in a car and he had to come back in a bus. Anyway, so what the Maharik is saying, he's saying that these two things, when we take a look about honoring and revering your parents, there are things that are connected to them, not sitting in their place, not contradicting their words, not taking sides against them, helping them with food and drink, clothing, covering, coming and going, but simply something that's related to me, to my choices, and it's not affecting them in any way. I mean, they may not like it, but it's not affecting them in any way. Then that's not something that's involved with the mitzvah of honoring your father and mother. It's not saying you shouldn't listen to them, but saying it's not limited to the mitzvah of honoring your father and mother. 1 second. So accordingly, it would be allowed, and therefore he's saying that this question with regards to changing the nusach, to changing the way of prayer based on what the parents feel about it, that's not called contradicting the parents, because the parents don't have a say in how I am praying. Now, yeah, you should take your parents to shul, make sure they're seated, make sure they're taken care of, make sure they have their coffee in place when they're sitting down in the synagogue, make sure that no one's bothering them. But once you fully took care of your parents, how I want to pray personally, that's up to me. My parents can't tell me how I should pray. As long as I'm giving them the full honor and reverence, what I decide to do now for my own, that's my decision. And this is based on the question of whether you're allowed to marry someone that your parents don't like. So that's the first issue. Yes, questions?
He said the wrong doesn't affect the parents. What? I'm interfaith marriage.
I mean, with regards to this specific issue, the specific issue is interfaith marriage violating the honoring or revering your parents? No, but it's
Maybe you're being about your child about to consider interfaith marriage does affect you when you subject to a grandchildren from. So that's my question.
okay. So again, let's clarify. First of all, we're talking about what is the limit of the obligation, right? So we're talking about the obligation of the mitzvah. Okay. At the end of the day, the obligation of the mitzvah is not involved in who that person marries, regardless of what faith they marry. Now, they got to deal with for themselves, as far as making their decision in life if they're doing the right thing. But we're talking specifically with regards to the obligation of the mitzvah of honoring your parents. There's other laws with regards to marrying out of the faith. That's a separate issue. We're talking specifically with regards to honoring your father and mother, and yes, and they don't have the authority from a halachic standpoint to impose that upon you for this specific issue. Okay, yeah.
What is shame on the parents?
Again, are you doing something that's shaming them directly, or they just don't like what you're doing?
Well, they bring any shame directly.
Why are you bringing shame to them there? Okay, well, but you're not doing something that's shaming them. You're doing something that they don't like, that they feel shameful about. But if you would do something directly to them, maybe if you say, you can't come to my wedding, then that may be an issue. If you're doing something directly to them, but I don't. Again, shame is you're doing your life, and they feel how they feel about it. But yeah,
Well, we're right, David. In a certain community, if the child does something that would shame the parents, then the parents are shamed within that community. So the question now becomes is that something that, for instance, since the effect on the parents will be in the community that they live.
So you're asking the same question that he is, and my understanding is that if you're not directly doing something that's shaming the parents directly, the fact that they feel uncomfortable about what you're doing is not you going against your obligation to honor them.
He's eating a handstand in front of you.
If you're doing it right in front of your parents and right in their face, then yeah, then that's disrespectful. No, if you're doing something directly in their face disrespectfully, then that's not respecting them. We're talking about doing things on your own. Okay, I want to move on because we don't have a lot of time left. Now, the second question is with regards to keeping Jewish customs. This is a big question, okay? Because do I have to keep customs? What if I decide that I want to eat rice on Pesach? My Sephardi friend is eating rice on Pesach. I want to eat rice on Pesach. Do I have to keep the customs that I have? So to be clear, we have to know how to differentiate between things, and a lot of times these lines are blurred. There is a biblical law, which is something that the Torah tells us very clearly. this is the mitzvah. Biblical law tells us that you're not allowed to have any leaven in your house on Passover. Passover is just a good example, right? Or you have to eat matzah on Pesach, right? These are very clear biblical laws. Then there is a rabbinic law. A rabbinic law for Passover would be, for example, that you have to get rid of your chametz on Erev Pesach. Rabbinically, you have to, early in the morning on Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach, you have to burn all your chametz and get rid of it. In other words, biblically, it could be until the afternoon. Rabbinically, you have to get rid of it even earlier. Now, a minute, the custom would be, well, because I don't eat chametz, so I'm also not going to eat rice. That's a custom. Okay? And these things are these lines are blurred. So now we're going to take a story. We're going to take a little journey, which is going to take us through different European countries. With this regard, I'm going to show a video. I know earlier we had subtitles. These videos don't have subtitles. I'm sorry about that. But let's take a look.
For the 16th centuries, Jewish life in Western Europe unraveled, torn apart by wave after wave of forced expulsion. In France, Jews were expelled not once, but 3 times during the 14th century, the final blow falling in 1394. In the closing decade of the 15th century, the Jews were banished from Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, Portugal, Navarre, and Provence. And the 16th century brought fresh waves of displacement from Calabria to Puglia, Naples, and the Papal States. With each decree, centuries of tradition and memory were uprooted, and the map of Jewish Europe steadily shrank. As the gates of the West slammed shut, new doors opened in the East. The Ottoman Empire became a haven for the displaced. Istanbul, Cairo, Salonika, and high in the hills of the Holy Land, suffered. These cities welcomed the exiles and offered the chance to rebuild. In these bustling ports and mountaintop towns, Jews from every corner of Europe found themselves side by side, each carrying their unique traditions. What happens when centuries of ancestral customs from distinct communities are forced to come together? The responsa written in 16th century Salonika by Rabbi Shmuel de Medina offers a rare and telling glimpse into that moment. He describes how the Ashkenazim, migrants from the German lands, held fast to their ancestral customs, living contentedly in Salonika alongside fellow Jews whose prayer rites differed in some details. But in most cases, a different pattern emerged. Jews expelled from Provence, Calabria, Sicily, and Apulia gradually gave up their inherited prayer rites and adopted the Sephardic version. The reason was simple. The Sephardim, Jews who had fled Spain and Portugal, formed the majority in the Ottoman cities. Still, not everyone was ready to blend in. Shmuel writes of one immigrant community divided each. Most members wanted to switch to the Sephardic rite, but others insisted on praying the way their ancestors had prayed. The question was brought to Rabbi Shmuel de Medina: may a community abandon its ancestral liturgy for another? The Sephardic rite was well established, but it was not their own. Were they bound to honor their past, or free to adapt to what was more popular in the present? This question about alterations to custom and liturgy offers a revealing glimpse into the fabric of Jewish life in the 16th century.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go through this rather quickly because we're late on time. Is it permissible for people to change their liturgy and thereby basically changing their customs? The question of text number 8 we basically read on we basically saw on the video. So to understand this, he goes back to another Talmudic story. There's a Jewish community known as Beis Shan, which is a suburb of Tyre. and they had a custom that they would go back and forth for business travel, and in order to get over, they would have to go by boat. There was a short boat ride, and they accepted upon themselves the custom that on Friday they won't go do business because you may get lost on Shabbos. You may come too late. You may not be able to prepare the food necessary for Shabbos. What happened was, a generation later, the economic hardships led to later generations questioning the custom of not traveling at all on Friday. And they said, we could go early on Friday, we'll cross the river, we'll be back on time for Shabbos. And this way we can make more money because we have to make the business necessary in the city of Tyre to make the necessary money. They weren't doing as well. And so the question was, if they could forsake their previous custom, which they accepted upon themselves in their community, not to travel on Friday at all, and because it may violate Shabbos. So text number 9, the Talmud. This is from the Talmud. Talmud says the people of Beishan had the custom to go from Tyre to Sidon on Friday. Their children went to Rabbi Yochanan and said to him, "For our ancestors it was possible; for us it's impossible." In other words, to keep that tradition of not traveling on Friday. Said he to them, "Your ancestors have already taken the stringency upon themselves. As it says, 'Hear, my child, the instruction of your father, and forsake not the teaching of your mother.'" So what he was basically saying is that if you have a custom that is kept within your community, you can change it. Once your ancestors take upon themselves that custom, you can change it. So now comes the question: the Maharsh Dam is the one that was now being asked about changing from the Ashkenazi prayer book to the Sephardic. And again, this is all going back to the original question, which was presented to Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the first Chabad rabbi, and the issue was, could you change a custom? And he's saying, look at the previous question that was brought up to the Maharsh Dam about the Ashkenazi living in the Sephardic communities. And basically what he said is that there's a difference in the type of customs that there are. There are certain customs that prevent neglect of halacha. One example is, as I said, eating rice. The reason that we don't eat rice is because eating rice could eventually come to eating chametz, and we have that concern. But then there are certain laws that are generally just enhance Jewish life. They're not necessarily customs that we're afraid you may violate something, but that they are going to enhance Jewish life in some way. And over here, if it's not protecting from violating something, like the case of the Tyre and Sidon, where they were afraid that they're going to violate Shabbos, that was a big concern. So he said, in that case, you can't override a previous custom. But in a case where they're just trying to enhance their Jewish tradition, like it's our custom that we don't sing on Shabbos, and then you come to Chabad Shul and they're singing beautifully on Shabbos. You say, in my synagogue we never sang on Shabbos, so I'm not going to sing. Well, singing is changing the custom is going to just enhance your service. It's not taking away from anything, and it's not a question of affecting your activity as a Jew in any way. Text number 10. The Talmudic evidence suggests that the insistence to retain ancestral custom applies to those that protect one from a prohibition, even just a trace of a prohibition. However, in a case like this where the custom isn't designed to protect against any aspect of a transgression, the principle forsake not the teaching of your mother does not apply. So is it allowed? He says, the Maharsh Dam says that yes, you would be allowed to change your custom because it's not at all affecting affecting practice or prohibition in any way, but it's just a way of enhancing the way that you pray. And so if you're going to pray a little bit different, it's not going to affect and it's not going to affect you in any way. And so the Alter Rebbe used this as well. So he made it clear that this is also now with the two issues. One was contradicting the parents that wasn't affected. Over here also, it's not a protective custom. So, but what we see from here very clearly is you have to know how to counterbalance the issue. You have to know, a rabbi has to be able to look at the situation, look at where we're at now, look at that particular case which we brought up previously, and how could we counterbalance and use those counterweights to see, well, is this actually like that? Is this situation the same, etc. Text number 11. He does come to the conclusion and say, however, since your intentions are noble, aiming for great mitzvah, bringing peace, I will join in supporting you, he says. I will instruct and urge the congregation to maintain the Ashkenazi order of prayer from Baruch She'amar until the conclusion of the Amidah, provided that the locals heed your request to be at peace with the new congregation and refrain from provoking disputes with their children who wish to attend, for peace is vitally important. Thus speaks one who loves you and sincerely seeks your well-being. Shnei Zalman, son and master, my father, teacher, Baruch of blessed memory. So what did he say? He said, according to the halacha, they're allowed to change their custom. But he says, we still have something important. And we mentioned this in the previous case, which is that you always want to have peace. Peace trumps everything. You always peace is always the most important thing. So he says, even though as far as a halachic ruling, I could tell you that they're allowed to change their custom, but in order to keep the peace, he's going to say from Baruch She'amar until after the Amidah, which is for the crux of the prayer, which basically that's 95% of that prayer we all agree on. He says that 95% that we agree on, I'm going to ask them to keep the Ashkenazi custom. From before and after, that's when they could switch it. So this way, we're still going to keep the peace. They're allowed to change their custom, but you should still always try to find peaceful ways to work around it and find a common denominator where we could all work together. And so he says, let's try and find the common denominator to work together, and then we'll come to that conclusion. And so let me just finish off. So the usual law is changing the Arizal's liturgy is within their halachic rights. However, says it's outweighed by communal peace, which is the most important thing. And so just to end off with a story, a rabbi was hosted for Shabbos by a man who was rigorously adherent to halacha. He wanted to keep everything in Jewish law to the T. And the rabbi is there, he's there with his family, they're sitting down and about to make Kiddush, and the man comes to make Kiddush, and he sees that the challah is not covered. And he berates his wife and says, why did you cover the challah? Don't you know you're supposed to cover the challah? So afterwards, after Kiddush, he went over to, the rabbi went over to this man and says to him, do you know why we cover the challah? He says, well, the reason we cover the challah is because when we're doing Kiddush, really you're supposed to do hamotzi first. But because we're doing the agafen first, so in order to not embarrass the bread, so we cover it over. So he says, so to not embarrass bread, we go to the lengths that we want to cover it up. But to embarrass another human being, and here you do it in front of the rabbi and in front of all his family. This is the way it is. So a lot of times, what we call well, in Yiddish we call it the fifth chelek of Shulchan Aruch. There's 4 sections in the Code of Jewish Law. There's also a 5th, and that's common sense, and that's being careful in what we do. So we have some personal principles, human dignity, marital harmony, communal peace, and how to counterweight that with the decisions that the rabbi makes. Next week we're going to talk about how emotional and situational wisdom shape rabbinic responses. And now we're going to go over the lesson
4. Counterweights. 1. Halacha includes fundamental values such as dignity, shalom, light, marital, and darkei shalom, communal peace. These principles often function as counterweights within the halacha process, recalibrating things in unforeseen ways. When multiple interpretations of a Talmudic ruling exist, the majority view carries significant weight. However, a compelling halacha He may justify reliance on a legitimate, albeit non-mainstream interpretation, resulting in a dispensation. 3. To uphold kavod and shalom bayit, Rabbi Moshe Isserles invoked Rabbeinu Tam's minority position, permitting a wedding initially scheduled for Friday to be conducted on Shabbat. Rabbi Yus demonstrated through Talmudic evidence that the mitzvot of honoring and revering parents apply exclusively to a parent's direct needs, not a child's decisions, such as whom to marry and which liturgy to adopt. 5. Rabbi Shmuel de Medina held that only minhagim instituted as safeguards against halachic violations, carry binding authority. Other customs, though cherished, do not hold the same legal weight. Accordingly, immigrants could switch to the Sephardic Nusach, liturgical rites. 6. Although Hasidim were halachically permitted to adopt the Arizal's Nusach, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi ruled that the counterweight of communal peace in one Russian town outweighed this permission, rendering the change inadvisable. 7. If Kavod HaBriot, Shalom Bayit, and Derech Shalom influence halachic things, then it's likewise guide personal conduct. Sensitivity, harmony, and respect should inform daily interactions and decision-making, ensuring that core values shape not only legal discourse, but also everyday life.
Okay. Today, thank you everyone. You go to myjli.com/CCRR for more insights and lessons and all kinds of good stuff. Thank you to those who joined us online. We will end this conversation now. Second.